The galactic combat arena was unlike any battleground in the universe. It was a massive coliseum, surrounded by towering energy walls, with thousands of spectators from countless species gathered to watch warriors fight for glory. At the center of the arena stood Drexal the Unyielding, a towering alien with 4 muscular arms, each one capable of wielding a weapon with deadly precision. He had won over 1,000 battles, his name feared across the galaxy. No one had ever defeated him. He was a legend, a warrior without equal. And now, he stood there, smirking at the challenger before him, a human. The laughter from the audience was deafening. A human? Fighting Drexal in melee combat? It was the most ridiculous thing they had ever seen. The other warriors, the merchants, even the announcer could not hide their amusement. Humans were known for their technology, their spaceships, their strategic minds, but not for their swordsmanship. They were considered physically weak compared to the dominant species of the galaxy. And yet, standing calmly before Drexal was Ethan Graves, a human swordsman, holding nothing but a simple steel sword. No energy weapons, no advanced armor, nothing that suggested he was ready to face a warrior of Drexal's caliber. Drexal grinned, his deep voice booming across the arena. "Is this a joke, human? Do you truly believe you can stand against me with that primitive weapon?" He raised 2 of his forearms in mock surrender, laughing loudly. "I will only need half my strength to crush you." The crowd roared with laughter, convinced that this fight would end in seconds. Even the betting screens began flashing absurdly low odds in Ethan's favor. There was no chance of him winning. But Ethan remained silent. His grip on the sword was firm but relaxed. His dark eyes never left Drexal, and there was no fear in them. The moment the signal was given, Drexal lunged forward with terrifying speed, swinging his twin energy blades in an arc designed to cut his opponent in half. The air crackled as the glowing weapons sliced through it, and everyone in the arena expected to see the human fall in an instant. But something impossible happened. Ethan wasn't there. He had moved. Not with brute force, not with the enhanced reflexes of cybernetic implants, but with something far more precise. His footwork was effortless, his body shifting just enough to let the deadly blades pass inches away without touching him. The crowd gasped, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Drexal frowned. He had expected to feel the satisfying resistance of his blades cutting through flesh, but there was nothing. He turned, and before he could react, Ethan's sword flicked forward. It was a blur so fast that most in the audience didn't even see it move. A thin cut appeared on Drexal's armored forearm. It was shallow, barely a scratch, but it was there. For the first time in centuries, Drexal had been struck first. The laughter in the arena stopped. The smug expressions on the alien spectators turned into ones of uncertainty. Drexal's eyes narrowed, his amusement gone. "Lucky strike," he growled, adjusting his stance. This time, he wouldn't underestimate the human. He attacked again, using a flurry of blows so fast they left streaks of blue light in the air. His forearms worked in perfect harmony, his movements refined by centuries of training. It was a technique no one had ever survived. But Ethan did not fall. He weaved between the strikes like a shadow, his body moving with a fluidity that defied logic. Each time a blade came close, he was already gone. His sword moved only when necessary, deflecting an attack with minimal effort, making Drexal look slow in comparison. The audience sat in stunned silence. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some desperate attempt to survive. This was mastery. Drexal's frustration turned to rage. With a roar, he activated his secondary blades, 2 more weapons extending from his lower arms. Now, he had 4 energy swords, each one capable of cutting through solid steel. The arena lit up as he launched his deadliest technique, a spinning hurricane of slashes, so fast and powerful that no one had ever survived it. The crowd expected the human to finally meet his end. But Ethan still did not fall. He didn't retreat. He didn't panic. Instead, he stepped forward. His sword flashed once. He didn't retreat. He didn't panic. Instead, he stepped forward. His sword flashed once. There was a sharp metallic sound, followed by silence. Draxal stood frozen. Then, one by one, his four blades fell apart, cut cleanly at the hilts. His weapons, his pride, his legacy destroyed in an instant. A deep, stunned silence spread across the arena. The greatest warrior in the galaxy had just been disarmed by a human. Draxal took a step back, his breathing heavy. His arms trembled, not from injury, but from something he had not felt in centuries' fear. He stared at the human before him, no longer seeing a weak species, no longer laughing. Ethan had outclassed him. The human swordsman had done the impossible. The once mocking audience sat in silence, processing what they had just witnessed. And as Draxal slowly dropped to one knee, the traditional gesture of submission and respect, a single thought echoed through the minds of everyone watching: humanity was not weak. The arena still echoed with the laughter of thousands of spectators, their voices blending into a deafening roar. The sight before them was too ridiculous to take seriously: a human standing alone in the center of the battlefield, facing Draxal the unyielding, the greatest duelist in the galaxy. To them, it was not a duel, but an execution, a moment of entertainment before the inevitable conclusion. The betting booths barely registered any wagers in favor of the human challenger, and the screens displayed humiliating odds. The officials didn't even bother explaining the rules in detail. Everyone already knew the outcome. Draxal himself stood relaxed, his massive four-armed frame towering over Ethan, his smirk widening as he observed the human's primitive steel sword. It was pathetic. The Zorvathian warlord had fought warriors who wielded energy-infused weapons, plasma whips, and gravity-forged blades that could slice through battleships. Yet, here stood a human with nothing but metal, as if this were some ancient duel from a forgotten era. With exaggerated arrogance, Draxal stretched two of his arms, flexing his muscles for the crowd before bringing them behind his back in a casual stance. He would not even use them. "One pair will be enough," he boomed, his deep voice carrying across the arena. It would be unfair to use all four against such delicate prey. The crowd erupted in laughter, enjoying the humiliation of the human even before the fight had begun. Ethan said nothing, his expression unreadable. His grip on the sword was firm but relaxed, his posture eerily calm. He did not seem nervous, nor did he react to the mockery surrounding him. This only fueled Draxal's amusement further. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with confidence. "You must be brave, human, or incredibly foolish. But do not worry, I will make this quick. I would hate for you to suffer too much." The announcer gave the signal. The duel had begun. Draxal moved first, and it was terrifying. Despite his massive size, he was fast, faster than any being of his weight and build should be. His two remaining arms wielded twin energy blades that crackled with a bright blue glow, their edges vibrating at speeds that could cut through reinforced armor. He aimed to end the fight immediately, swinging both weapons in a deadly arc designed to cut the human in half. The crowd cheered, already expecting the fight to be over. But then, something happened. Ethan wasn't there. The energy blades sliced through empty space. Draxal's eyes narrowed as he felt the air shift. His opponent had moved at the last possible second, without panic, without wasted motion. Ethan had not jumped or dodged wildly like a desperate fighter. He had simply stepped aside, letting the lethal strike pass inches from his body, as if he had seen it coming before it even began. The crowd's laughter died, replaced by murmurs of confusion. No one avoided Draxal's first attack. No one. It was a death sentence. And yet, the human had done it effortlessly. Draxal let out a low growl, his amusement flickering for just a moment before he smirked again. "Not bad," he admitted. "Perhaps you are not completely useless." He lunged again, his twin blades moving even faster, striking from two different angles at once. This time, there was no way the human could avoid both attacks. The speed was too great, the angles too precise. It was an attack designed to overwhelm and eliminate. But Ethan did not panic. His sword moved, and for the first time, it was Draxal who felt the impact. It was not a powerful strike, Not a brutal counterattack, but a precise deflection. The human's blade redirected one of the energy swords while his body shifted just enough to evade the second. It was flawless, a movement so refined and controlled that it seemed impossible. The crowd gasped as Draxol stumbled slightly, his balance thrown off for just a moment. His smirk faded. The warrior narrowed his eyes, focusing now. His opponent was not just lucky. There was something deliberate in the way the human moved. Something dangerous. But that was impossible. Humans had no business excelling in melee combat, not against species that had trained in battle for generations. Draxol refused to believe it. "Enough games," he snarled, tightening his grip on his weapons. "Let us see how long you can survive when I stop holding back." He attacked with brutal efficiency, launching a relentless storm of strikes, each one fast enough to cut down warriors twice Ethan's size. The energy blades blurred as they moved, creating arcs of light as they slashed through the air with deadly precision. But Ethan was already moving. He was no longer just dodging. He was flowing through the attacks like water, his sword barely touching Draxol's weapons, deflecting only when necessary. His movements were controlled, perfect, as if he had seen these attacks thousands of times before. The crowd fell silent. Something was wrong. This was not how the fight was supposed to go. Draxol's strikes became desperate, his frustration clear. He had fought warriors with enhanced speed, extra limbs, reinforced bodies. None had lasted this long. Yet a human was standing before him, dodging his every move, not even breaking a sweat. It was infuriating. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Ethan struck back. It was not a heavy blow, not a devastating attack, just a single, controlled cut. The audience barely saw it happen, but when they looked closer, they realized Draxol was bleeding. A thin red line ran across his armored forearm. The first hit of the duel had been made, and it was the human who landed it. Draxol froze, staring at the wound. It was shallow, meaningless in terms of damage, but that wasn't the point. The greatest warrior in the galaxy had been hit first. The crowd did not cheer. They did not laugh. They simply watched, stunned into silence. Ethan slowly stepped back, lowering his sword slightly. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. He simply looked at Draxol as if he had already won. And for the first time in his life, Draxol felt doubt creeping into his mind. The arena was silent. The crowd, which had mocked the human only moments ago, now sat frozen in disbelief. Draxol, the greatest duelist in the galaxy, the warrior who had never been bested, stood with a thin line of blood running down his arm. The first strike had been made not by him, not by a warrior of legend, but by a human. The realization sank into his mind like a slow-moving poison, twisting his confidence into something unfamiliar. His grip on his twin energy swords tightened, his forearms flexing with raw power. This wasn't right. This wasn't how the battle was supposed to go. The human should have been crushed already, his pathetic steel sword shattered, his body broken under the force of Draxol's relentless attacks. And yet Ethan Graves stood before him, calm and unreadable, as if this fight was beneath him. Draxol clenched his jaw, pushing aside the uneasy feeling creeping into his mind. This was no time for doubt. He had fought thousands of battles, faced warriors with enhanced reflexes, cybernetic augmentations, and centuries of experience. This human was nothing special. He could not be special. With a deep growl, Draxol charged, his massive frame a blur of speed and power. His blades struck like lightning, moving in unpredictable patterns designed to overwhelm even the most skilled opponents. He used every technique he had mastered, every feint, every deceptive motion, yet Ethan was already moving. The human sword danced through the air with effortless grace, a mere flick of his wrist deflecting Draxol's most powerful strikes. It wasn't just speed. It wasn't just skill. It was something more. It was precision beyond logic, a technique that did not rely on strength, but on something far greater understanding. Ethan did not fight with brute force. He did not fight with instinct. He fought with a mastery so refined, so controlled, that it made Droxal's raw strength look clumsy in comparison. For the first time in his life, Droxal felt slow. The crowd sensed it too. The way Ethan moved, the way he deflected attacks with the barest amount of effort, it was not normal. It was not something that should exist in a duel. The other warriors in the stands, those who had once admired Droxal as the pinnacle of combat, now watched in stunned silence. Some even leaned forward, their expressions shifting from amusement to something else entirely, fear. Droxal refused to believe it. He let out a furious roar, activating the energy shields on his secondary arms. He had been holding back, underestimating his opponent, but no longer. He would use everything. 4 blades, 4 arms, and the full force of his warrior heritage. No one had survived against his ultimate form. No one. And yet, as he lunged forward, Ethan stepped in, not back, not to the side, but forward. It was suicide. No one willingly closed the distance against Droxal. But before the warlord could react, Ethan's blade moved. Once, there was no flash of energy, no explosion of force, just a clean, precise strike. And in that moment, Droxal's world stopped. His 4 weapons shattered. The crowd gasped in horror as the pieces of Droxal's energy blades fell to the ground, useless fragments of what had once been the most feared weapons in the galaxy. His hands trembled, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. How? His weapons were made from quantum-hardened alloys, enhanced with phase technology that could cut through reinforced starship plating. How had a simple steel sword broken them? But Ethan did not answer. He simply stepped back, his sword still held at his side, as if the fight no longer interested him. Droxal staggered, his breath heavy. His arms, once strong and confident, now hung limp at his sides. He looked down at his hands, at the broken hilts of his weapons, and felt something he had never known before: helplessness. The arena was deathly silent. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The warlord who had never been defeated, who had crushed thousands of opponents without effort, now stood unarmed and outmatched. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Your technique is powerful," he said, "but it is predictable. Strength means nothing if it is wasted on meaningless force." He lifted his sword slightly, letting the dim lights of the arena reflect off the simple steel blade. "You fight like a man trying to break a mountain with his fists. I fight like a man who already knows where the mountain's weakest point is." Droxal's breathing grew unsteady. He had fought countless warriors, each one a challenge in their own way. But never had he faced someone like this. Ethan had not won with speed, or power, or brute force. He had won with something greater, a technique beyond the stars, a skill so refined that it made all other warriors look like amateurs in comparison. The warlord dropped to one knee. Not out of injury, not out of weakness, but out of respect. The greatest duelist in the galaxy had been defeated, and a human had done it. The silence of the crowd broke as whispers spread through the arena. They had laughed at him. They had mocked him. They had dismissed him as weak. Now, no one was laughing. The announcer hesitated before finally declaring what should have been impossible. The victor of the duel, Ethan Graves, the human swordsman. And across the galaxy, where once humanity had been seen as nothing more than a race of strategists and engineers, a new fear began to grow. For if this was what a single human warrior could do, what would happen when humanity sent an army? The silence in the arena was unnatural. Moments ago, it had been filled with roaring laughter, deafening cheers, and the cocky certainty of a crowd that had already decided the outcome of the duel before it had even begun. But now, that certainty had shattered, just like the twin energy blades of Droxal the Unyielding. The once mighty warlord knelt in the center of the battlefield, staring at his empty hands, his weapons lying in useless fragments around him. The arena's towering walls, which had echoed with his victories for years, now seemed to close in on him, trapping him in a reality he refused to accept. He had lost. And not just lost, he had been humiliated. The human, Ethan Graves, stood motionless a few feet away, his steel sword held loosely in his grip. He did not look triumphant. He did not celebrate. His expression was unreadable, his stance still relaxed, as if the duel had been nothing more than a trivial exercise. That quiet confidence sent a chill down the spines of the watching warriors, for it meant only one thing: the human had never been in any real danger. The greatest duelist in the galaxy had given everything, had fought with all his might, and yet Ethan had controlled the fight from the very beginning. It was never a contest. Draxol clenched his fists, his forearms trembling. His entire life had been built on one truth: he was invincible. He had never been beaten, never even come close to defeat. His victories had shaped the laws of combat itself, his name whispered with fear in every warrior clan across the stars. And now, in front of thousands, in front of his people, that legend had been shattered by a lone human with nothing but a steel sword and a technique beyond comprehension. His breath was heavy, his pride screaming at him to rise, to strike again, to prove that this was just a mistake, an accident. But deep down, a darker realization settled into his bones. It wasn't a mistake. He had truly been outmatched. The crowd, still reeling from the shock, did not know how to react. Some remained frozen, unwilling to accept what they had witnessed. Others whispered among themselves, their voices hushed and uncertain. For years, they had worshipped Draxol as an untouchable force. Now, they saw him for what he truly was: just another warrior. And worse, a defeated one. Somewhere in the distance, a lone spectator laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to mock. But it spread like wildfire through the stands, a ripple of disbelief, then amusement, then contempt. The people who had once adored Draxol now saw him in a different light. He was no longer the undefeated champion. He was no longer the legend they had believed him to be. He was just another fallen warrior. And in the brutal culture of the Zorvathian people, a warrior who falls is a warrior who is forgotten. The warlord's stomach twisted as he sensed the shift. Just moments ago, the audience would have died for him. Now, they looked at him with pity. His hands curled into fists, his claws digging into his palms, but the pain did nothing to erase the truth. The moment his weapons had shattered, so had his reputation. Ethan finally moved. He took a slow step forward, and even that simple motion sent a wave of tension through the air. Draxol stiffened, expecting an insult, a final blow, something to end this nightmare completely. But the human did none of those things. Instead, he did something far worse. He offered his hand. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was devastating. Ethan was offering mercy, offering to help him up. It was not a gesture of respect. It was a declaration. You are no longer my equal. I no longer see you as a threat. Draxol's entire body burned with humiliation. He had fought warriors who had spit on his fallen enemies, who had crushed them underfoot to prove their dominance. But this was worse. Ethan was not mocking him. Ethan was acknowledging his defeat as a fact so undeniable that he did not even feel the need to gloat. A sharp, guttural cry tore through the air, and before Draxol even realized what had happened, he swatted the human's hand away. The force of the slap sent a sharp sting through Ethan's wrist, but he did not react. He merely lowered his arm, his expression remaining as calm as ever. The silence in the arena deepened. Draxol's chest heaved, his breath uneven, but he knew it was over. He could not change what had happened. He was defeated. A new sound filled the arena. The sound of shifting loyalties. Warriors who had once stood as Draxol's loyal followers now turned their attention elsewhere. It wasn't that they hated him. It wasn't that they wished to see him suffer. But he was no longer the strongest, and in the world of warriors, strength was everything. Their gazes, once filled with admiration for Draxol, now shifted to Ethan. The human had done the impossible. He had defeated a legend. And in doing so, he had become a legend himself. Draxol knew what came next. He had seen it happen to others before him. The fall. The whispers would spread. Stories would twist the truth, making him seem weaker than he really was. Some would claim he had been sick. Others would say he had never truly been that strong to begin with. And soon, his name would fade. His legacy would disappear. The warlord slowly stood, forcing himself to meet Ethan's gaze one last time. There was no hatred in the human's eyes, no arrogance, no cruelty, just understanding. And somehow, that made it even worse. Without another word, Drexel turned and walked away. No one stopped him. No one called for him to return. The crowd erupted as the announcer's voice finally found the strength to speak. The victor, Ethan Graves. Cheers thundered across the arena. Warriors roared Ethan's name, the same warriors who had once mocked him. But Ethan did not raise his sword in triumph. He did not bask in the glory. He simply sheathed his weapon, turned, and walked away, leaving behind the ruins of a fallen legend. And in that moment, the galaxy changed forever. Ethan Graves walked through the towering halls of the Zorvathian stronghold, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stone. Convinced of human inferiority, now watched him in silence. Some looked at him with newfound curiosity. Others still held traces of resentment. But none, not a single one, dared to look at him with mockery anymore. That time was over. He had arrived as a challenger, a fool in the eyes of the galaxy's greatest warriors. He was supposed to fail. He was supposed to be a warning to those who thought they could challenge Zorvathian supremacy. But instead, he had become a warning of his own. His technique had shattered their strongest champion. His skills had rewritten what they thought they knew about combat. And now, they stood in the presence of a man who had done the impossible, uncertain of how to face him. Ethan said nothing. He did not bask in their awe, nor did he demand recognition. Respect was not asked for. It was earned. And he had done that with his blade, with his skill, and with his restraint. His victory over Drexel had been total, but he had chosen not to humiliate him. That choice, more than the duel itself, was what left the strongest warriors in the stronghold uneasy. Strength alone was something they understood. Strength with control? That was terrifying. As he reached the great hall, a deep, rumbling voice broke the silence. Human, Ethan turned to see General Vorke, one of the oldest and most respected warriors in Zorvathian history, standing with his massive arms crossed. His crimson armor was adorned with battle scars, his deep-set eyes studying Ethan with an unreadable intensity. Unlike the others, Vorka had not been in the arena. But he had heard. Everyone had heard. The story of Drexel's fall had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the warrior caste. Ethan knew this moment would come. The old warriors would not accept him easily. But he was ready. "You have shaken the foundation of our traditions," Vorke said, stepping forward, his boots heavy against the stone. "You have defeated our strongest. You have made many question what they once believed." His gaze darkened. "That is dangerous." Ethan met his eyes without hesitation. Truth is always dangerous. The warriors around them stirred, some whispering, others watching with narrowed eyes. Vorke let the words settle before nodding slowly. "You fight with a discipline we have never seen. You do not waste movement. You do not rely on brute strength. You use patience and precision in ways that unsettle many." He paused, then added, "You remind me of our ancestors." That caught the attention of the surrounding warriors. A murmur spread through the hall. The ancestors, the first Zorvathian warriors, the ones who had built their empire. They had fought with discipline, not just savagery. But over time, as they conquered, as they dominated, many had abandoned refinement for raw power. And now, before them stood a human, a species they had never seen as warriors embodying the very principles their own people had forgotten. Ethan remained silent, letting them absorb the truth. He did not need to argue. The duel had spoken for him. Vorke studied him for a long moment, then did something that stunned the entire hall. He unsheathed his blade. The polished metal gleamed under the dim lights, its edge carrying the weight of centuries of battles. He flipped it in his hand and offered it hilt first to Ethan. The air grew thick with tension. This was not just a gesture. This was the greatest honor a Zorvathian could give. A warrior only offered his blade to someone he acknowledged as an equal or as someone worthy of leading. Ethan did not move immediately. He understood the gravity of the moment. Slowly, he reached out, wrapping his fingers around the hilt. For the first time in the history of this warrior empire, a human now held a Zorvathian warrior's blade. The respect he had earned was no longer just in their eyes, it was in their traditions. The silence broke as another warrior knelt. Then another. Then another. One by one, warriors who had once doubted him now bowed their heads in recognition. He had not just defeated their champion, he had revived something they had forgotten. He had shown them that strength was not just about power, but about control, mastery, and respect. Ethan returned the blade to Vorka. "I did not come here for titles," he said. "I did not come here to be your leader." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of every warrior who knelt before him. "But if you want to learn what I know, if you want to reclaim what you have lost, then stand." Slowly, they rose. And in that moment, Ethan Graves was no longer an outsider. He was no longer just a human swordsman. He was one of them. And across the galaxy, where whispers of his victory had already begun to spread, another realization took root. If a single human could change the traditions of an entire warrior empire, what would happen when humanity decided to shape the fate of the stars?